Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, it was a throne speech, arguably like no other in recent history of Barbados, an idyllic Caribbean island known more for its famous daughter Rihanna, its lovely sandy beaches and its delightfully warm aquamarine waters than for its politics. But now Barbados is making history by becoming the first country in almost 3 decades to sever ties with the British royal family and to become a republic. From November 2021, Queen Elizabeth II, who is the head of state in the UK, and 15 other realms of the Commonwealth, including Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Jamaica, as well as a clutch of other Caribbean nations, will be dropped by Barbados as the country's monarch. The last country to do so was Mauritius in 1992. In a speech written by the Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, the Governor-General of Barbados, Sandra Mason, said the country had loitered on colonial premises long enough and the time had come to leave that era of Barbadian history behind.
First Prime Minister, the Right Excellent Errol Walton Barrow, cautioned against loitering on colonial premises. That warning is as relevant today as it was in 1966. Having attained independence over half a century ago, our country can be in no doubt about its capacity for self-governance. The time has come to fully leave our colonial past behind. Barbadians want a Barbadian head of state. This is the ultimate statement of confidence in who we are and what we are capable of achieving. Hence, Barbados will take the next logical step towards full sovereignty and become a republic by the time we celebrate our 55th anniversary of independence.
That's Dame Sandra Mason, who is the Governor-General of Barbados. Well, for reaction to that announcement by Barbados that it's leaving its colonial past behind, I'm joined now by the popular Caribbean writer and filmmaker Imruh Bakari, well known in the UK and the West Indies for his books, his films and his documentaries, assessing the relationship between the UK and the Caribbean. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. First of all, what's your reaction to this announcement by Barbados that it will no longer have Queen Elizabeth as its head of state?
Well, my first reaction, casually paying attention to the news, was that it's probably a long time in coming, and I was always wondering why other Caribbean states had not considered in the same serious way that Barbados is doing now, even though there are some Caribbean republics already, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, for example, but most of the other islands are still part of the monarchy or under the rule of Britain, as it were, constitutionally.
So in terms of the new political system that Barbados is now going to adopt, presumably, I mean, it's now going to have its own head of state, but it's still going to retain its current parliamentary system of government. I mean, is that your understanding?
That's the general understanding. I don't think the two are inimical. It's really a much more fundamental question, I think, than simply the parliamentary system, as it were. I think there's a lot of other considerations, particularly at the time in which it is being announced.
And on a practical level as well, I mean, becoming a republic, I suppose, means that Barbados will also remove the UK-based Privy Council as its final. The Caribbean Court of Justice will now be the country's highest court.
Well, in a way, that's already in process. I'm not a politician or a political analyst by any stretch of the imagination, but in following the developments in the region, the whole idea of a Caribbean appeals court, I think, is already in place. So there are a number of institutional structures which are already functioning independent to the sort of British institutional framework, as it were, but very much in relation to it because of the legacy, of course.
And all this coming in the wake of the Windrush scandal in the UK and the Black Lives Matter movement in the UK and the US. I mean, has that awakened a greater sense of independence in the people of the Caribbean?
It's interesting that you would mention those two issues, the Windrush issue and the Black Lives Matter issue. Because they are indicative of the time we're living in, which is why this announcement, if it had come maybe, 3-4 years ago, it might not have been so dramatic, but it's very dramatic within the context. The Windrush situation, of course, has been an ongoing injustice and an ongoing struggle against a serious injustice by Britain, particularly during the post-war years, which has been cemented by a number of legislations that have been passed in British immigration legislations, which Black people or Black communities in Britain have been fighting against since the 1970s. The Black Lives Matter is a sort of resurgence of a movement against racism and against colonial violence, which again has a long history and which Black communities in Britain in particular, as extensions of the Caribbean, have been fighting against for decades. Now, on top of that, we have another sort of constituting framework, which is the pandemic we have here, the corona COVID-19 situation, which as a global phenomenon has, I think, revealed or once again underlined the fragility of Caribbean economies. And a lot of people in the Caribbean are currently in the midst of thinking beyond this pandemic as to what kind of societies they're really going to have to put together for it to be sustainable. Now, in terms of the Caribbean, Black Lives Matter has a very specific significance because it's also linked to the issue of reparations. Reparations for the 400 years of enslavement of African peoples in that region. And again, the Caribbean is the home of a very vibrant reparations movement. Now, a lot of politicians, in my view, are buying into it because it's popular and because it's maybe seemingly the right gesture to make. But it's a very serious contention that has never been resolved. Hence, when Barbados therefore asks for this kind of new arrangement of Republican status, what it really means in this moment for myself as someone who is interested in history, is interested in the Pan-African world generally, is a rethinking of all the constitutions of those independent states and their relationships with each other and with their former colonial masters, as it were. So that's why this announcement is so significant at this particular time, in my view anyway.
So do you expect other Caribbean countries to follow the lead set by Barbados, or do you hope that they will follow the lead?
Well, I hope they would follow the lead, but it's not simply a sort of political gesture as such, but really understanding the consequences and the legacy to which they have to respond. That kind of action has to respond to. As I mentioned, the Caribbean is a post-plantation society. Let's not be fooled about that. We have manifestations of human resilience, reggae music, the arts, reggae music, the arts, literature, etc. But the Caribbean is a post-plantation society. That is where slavery was institutionalized. That is where racism was literally invented and actualized in its most virulent forms before even it spread to the United States, Latin America, etc. But equally so. I mean, we're not sort of measuring sort of degrees of anything here, but bringing the importance of the Caribbean, not simply of disparate islands into the frame, but as a very important region. As C.L.R. James, one of our great thinkers, has said, an important region in the formation of the modern world as we know it. So all the Caribbean leaders, I think, will have to be thinking, even those that are republics already, would have to be thinking what kind of relationships they're going to, you might say, forge between themselves so that they can become usefully situated in the world with Africa and with other regions of the world. This is why I think it's so important, and what I'm hoping would happen. That is my sort of hope as an artist, as a person who is connected to that region in a very personal way, etc.
And of course, it's one thing for the politicians to dream up something. It's quite another the way that people often react to it. I mean, we see in Africa, for example, politicians often come up with these grand ideas which have absolutely no meaning for the man and woman on the street, because as far as they're concerned, they've got more basic concerns. I mean, given that, is this a cause for jubilation in the Caribbean and amongst Caribbean people?
Forget the Pan-African movement and the Pan-African spirit was again born in the Caribbean, very much so, equally as anywhere else. Marcus Garvey, for example. We have the more modern and more recent manifestations of that spirit. And in fact, Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, referenced Errol Barrow. That was he was a leader of the 1950s and 60s, one of the generation that had participated in the war of 1939 to 45. And if you look at that generation, they produced, a lot of them served in the British military, the Air Force, for example, the armed forces. And after that, in the 1950s, into the independence period of the 60s, played a very significant role in African states. Ghana, for example, Nigeria, I think, East Africa. So that generation, when she's referring to Errol Barrow, she's referring to a very important populist and intellectual trend within Caribbean thinking and Caribbean culture. So therefore, I am saying there may be differences of opinion. Of course, there may be cynics along the way, but the momentum within Caribbean culture is predisposed to this kind of development.
Well, that's very enlightening, particularly for our viewers who are, across Africa, but also in other parts of the world. Now, also on a practical level, I mean, you raised a very interesting point about the issue of reparations. I mean, does this severing of ties with the British government, I mean, it's not a complete severance, but obviously they're moving away from being, tied to the UK with the Queen as head of state. Does it make it more or less likely that reparations will be considered by the UK as a serious issue? And we've got less than a minute before we have to take a break.
Well, that's a question for the British to decide how they will respond. But in terms of the Caribbean and the Pan-African world, it increases the solidarity and the momentum towards that claim, or making that claim a reality. That's how I would put it.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And I would ask you to stay with us because we'd like to talk with you some more. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about that announcement by Barbados that Queen Elizabeth will no longer be the country's head of state. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, the prosperous West Indian nation of Barbados has long flirted with the idea of becoming a republic since gaining independence in 1966. But now it's made that decision, announcing that it will cut ties with the British monarch before it celebrates its 55th independence anniversary from British rule in November 2021, and will transition to a republican system of government. After Barbados became independent in 1966, following 341 years of British rule, it chose to retain formal links with the British royal family, as did other self-governing Commonwealth nations such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand and Jamaica. But not anymore. Queen Elizabeth's office at Buckingham Palace has reacted by saying that the decision on whether Barbados should become a republic is a matter for the government and the people of the Caribbean nation. The reaction came after the Barbadian Prime Minister said it was time her country left the colonial past behind and removed the Queen as head of state. and the popular Caribbean writer and filmmaker Imruh Bakari, well known in the UK and the West Indies for his books, films and documentaries assessing the relationship between the UK and the Caribbean, is still with me. Thank you ever so much for staying with us. And before we went on a break, you talked about countries like Jamaica. And I suppose what is interesting is that, you know, you've got a country like Jamaica that's produced, as you mentioned, I mean, civil rights and black rights icons like Marcus Garvey and Bob Marley. I mean, it seems a bit odd that Jamaica is still holding fast to the Queen as its head of state when it could easily, you know, get rid of that last vestige, if you like, of colonialism.
Well, I'm not sure it's holding fast, but it's definitely been holding, like other territories. But of course, Jamaica stands out because of its status globally in global culture, popular culture, etc. And it's interesting, but I think even Barbados making the move that is making at this time is interesting, given the kinds of, let's say, reputation that each of these countries individually, Jamaica and Barbados, has in the popular imagination. Now, in the Caribbean, Barbados is seen as a very British type of country, a very ordered British in a very not always positive light. Whereas Jamaica is always seen as a kind of radical, rebellious country, not always, you know, in the best of lights either, but equally important. Here we have Barbados making this stand through its current Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, and we have Jamaica at the same time seemingly not quite convinced or undecided or yet to decide what it's doing. I think this tells us something about the complexity of the region itself and the fact that in each of these cases, we have very complex societies. We have a society in Barbados which seemingly very British, but with a very African and Afrocentric culture, popular culture among its people, and in a very, very cohesive to a great degree from what I know of that country. Jamaica, on the other side, from what I know of it, is a very stratified country, and the ruling class is very conservative. In spite of the Bob Marleys and in spite of Marcus Garveys, these people were for a long time despised in Jamaica by the ruling class. That is very conservative and indeed very racist in many ways. So here we have this complexity of Caribbean politics and Caribbean cultures, which the Caribbean, all of us still have to learn about and understand, and globally, and I'm speaking about the African world, the Pan-African world, we need to begin to understand and become familiar with to see how trends might evolve and the kind of relationships, the kinds of allegiances and the futures that we might be able to build. Jamaica also produced Michael Manley, one of the most radical, you know, prime ministers of his time in his era. At a time when I don't think Barbados was that seen to be that radical or equally radical. So here we are. But this is the nature of the region, and this is the work for politicians. People like myself, we try to intervene and respond and sort of nudge and provoke where we can.
Well, I want to. That's an absolutely fascinating sort of lesson through the intricate politics of the Caribbean there. I'd like to talk a little bit about yourself in just a minute, but I mean, you were talking about Barbados being described as the best governed, well, you didn't use those words, but in effect, it's been described as the best governed black society in the world because apparently it's developed governance structures and institutions that mark it out. So really the question should be, I mean, why did it take it so long to take that step of republicanism? I mean, countries like Nigeria, for instance, became a republic just 3 years after independence.
My short answer, again, as an artist, as a sort of critical, engaged person of the region, is that the plantation culture and the plantation society in the plantation era has been very resilient. And it's not been easy to transform Caribbean societies within the sort of what people would refer to post-colonial or the independent era, because of the constitutional arrangements and because, of course, there were also mechanisms for managing, you might say, rebellion, dissent, etc. One of the sort of real most effective mechanisms has been migration. The region has been an outflow of population since the beginning of the 20th century. The Windrush generation in Britain is relatively, that's the mid-20th century, the 1940s, 50s. But at the beginning of the 20th century, migration from the plantation societies had already begun. Hence, you have Caribbean communities in North America, for example. So that's been a mechanism of managing the sort of radical transformations or the threats towards a radical transformation in many of the, all of the territories for that matter. That would be how I would see it and see how I am linked to that kind of movement or social transformation in that sense.
Well, let's talk a little bit about yourself in the couple of minutes we've got sort of left. I mean, you documented the history of immigration from the Caribbean to the UK from the period of the Second World War until that sort of first Notting Hill riot, I think in 1958. You looked at the Windrush generation, etc. I mean, how have you and your work been affected by the Black Lives Matter movement and by that Windrush scandal in the UK that you touched on briefly earlier?
The work that you are specifically referring to is a film I made in 1981 called Riots and Rumors of Riots. In fact, that was made in a time when the media in Britain was quite monolithic, and there were very little options or opportunities that we could see, but I decided I wanted to make films. So that was my graduation film after about 3 years at film school in the UK. And I made that film distinctly because of the culture and the sort of arts movement that I was part of coming out of the 1970s. And the fact that I became interested in histories, oral histories, and the need to put a kind of coherence to those histories that would make sense to myself and others, to share with others. So that was the meaning of that. So therefore, that film was looking at what is now referred to as the Windrush generation. It was looking at their experiences in the 1950s, 40s into the 50s, culminating in the Notting Hill riots. But it was looking at it against the background of riots that were taking place in urban centers in Britain, 1980, 81, and I think 82. So that was the context in which it was emerging. And those uprisings in urban Britain had begun from about 1975.
Okay, I just want to say that I'm really sorry to interrupt you, Imruh, but we have a very diligent producer here who actually dug out some of your film footage, the old stuff, so we were watching it there. But I want to thank you very much indeed for joining us, Imruh Bakari, the Caribbean writer and filmmaker there. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja and London. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching.